And I believe this is possible by using a combination of those two strategies, or what I call a flexible hybrid approach.
Our next speaker is Antonia Gefahrt, a psychology graduate from the University of Salzburg, whose research focuses on improving communication strategies for vegan advocacy. She is now preparing to continue this work as a doctoral candidate and is building Psy for Veganism, a project dedicated to research and training in advocacy. In her presentation, Antonia will share research comparing abolitionists and new welfarist strategies and showing what psychology can teach us about making vegan advocacy more effective. So please welcome Antonia Gefahrt.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. This was me last year, attending the conference from home. I had a great conference buddy, but also quite a bit of FOMO, missing out on the amazing vegan vibes here. So this is really great. It's really great to be here and to even be presenting. So yeah, I'm Antonia Gefahrt. I'm a social psychologist. And you can also find me as Psy for Veganism on social media, mainly on Instagram. And my goal in life is to find the best communication strategies to get us at least closer to a vegan world. So to get started, I'd like to invite you into a thought experiment. Imagine a continuum. Right in the middle, you have people who are basically omnivore by default, so people who really haven't given the matter much thought as yet. Then on the left are meat eaters, meat lovers, probably also vegan haters. And on the right, you have us as committed vegans. And then there are various stages in between. Now, I'd like you to think back to the last conversation you had with a non-vegan. Where was this person on this continuum before your conversation and where afterwards? Also, what likely happened in the hours, days, or weeks after that conversation? Now, what if this isn't a line, but a pyramid? Now, what happens when people take their first initial steps towards either side is that it becomes much more easy to continue going down that way rather than changing your mind, which would mean that you have to climb back up. Now, the pyramid is used in psychology to describe what happens once people make a choice or take a decision. Because oftentimes what they do is that they come up with more and more arguments to convince themselves that their choice was the right one. And that way they become more and more entrenched in their own views, or in other words, they go down and down, down more and more their side of the pyramid. So what this all means now for vegan advocacy? Well, thinking of this like a pyramid made me change the way I looked at strategy quite a bit. Because first of all, it made me appreciate these small shifts a little bit more, because once people are on the right side of the pyramid, then gravity might actually do part of the job for us. But it also made me think a little bit more about the other side and the counterproductive effects. And it made me think, how can we maybe prevent people from going down that side of the pyramid? Now, speaking of strategy, there are two people I'd like you to meet. Abby and Newe. They are two animal rights activists who share the goal of a vegan world, but their approaches differ. So Abby is an abolitionist. She read all of Professors Gary Francioni and Anna Charlton's books, and this is an example of how she communicates.
Hi, I'm Abby. I believe that we have a moral obligation to live vegan, as there is no need to consume animal products. Ultimately, it's all about taste. But can a temporary sensory pleasure morally justify the exploitation and death of sentient beings? My answer is a clear no. What's yours?
Now, Newe, on the other hand, she completed all of the online courses from Dr. Melanie Joy, and this is a snippet of how she communicates.
Hi, I'm Newe. I believe that everyone can contribute to a better world, even if it's just a small step. A lot could be achieved if everyone were just a little more vegan, or simply as vegan as they feel they can be. How vegan can you be?
Now, these snippets were quite short, and there's obviously a little bit more to it. Just to give you an overview of the main differences and commonalities of these strategies. So, Abby and Newe differ in their asks, also in their moral standards, and in their method. So, Abby's strategy is quite straightforward and very logical, whereas Newe's approach is based on psychological theories like the foot in the door technique, which basically posits that once you have a small request, not only are people much more likely to agree with that one, but then as a result, they are also more likely to comply with larger changes later on. And there are also commonalities. Both of them are very friendly and empathetic. Now, the big question is, who has the better strategy? And in fact, I'd like to do a poll. I'm really curious what you think. So here are 3 options. So can we do a hands up for Team Abby? Who believes that Abby has the better strategy? Okay, not so many people. Now, can we do hands up for Team Newe? Who believes that she has the better strategy? Quite a few more, thank you. And who is option C? It depends, or not so sure. Also quite a few. Okay, that was actually me as well, which is why I conducted an experiment as part of my master's thesis to find out. And today I will speak about my findings, specifically which strategy performed better and why, also whether or not there were any exceptions, and I will also introduce a theoretical model that could maybe help explain, predict, and also optimize vegan advocacy. In fact, I'd like to start with a theoretical model because to me it was really important to not only find out which strategy performs better, but to understand why. Because I thought when we understand why, then maybe we can use this information to tweak our communication to make it better. So I was looking for a theoretical model that could really explain both what brings people closer towards veganism, but also what pushes them the other way. And here is what I came up with. I called it the VSMP, because it's basically a vegan adaptation of something called the social functional model of prejudice. I know it sounds awfully complicated, but don't worry about it, because the model itself is actually pretty simple. So what it posits is that vegans and vegan advocacy can pose various kinds of threats that elicit specific emotions and then lead to certain reactions. Now, first of all, vegan advocacy can be perceived as threatening people's alleged right and freedom to use animal products. And many non-vegans complain that we are interfering with their business and telling people what and what not to do, and they are not too happy about that. So I called it rights threat. Then non-vegans often also worry about their health when asked to go vegan, and also vegan worldviews can seem quite different, even incompatible, and that can also be a little bit threatening. Now, in theory, all this should lead to feelings of anger, and anger then to not so favorable responses, which can be, for example, vegophobia, speciesism, or rejection of vegan products. Now, there is one more threat category, that's morality threat, and that's actually a good thing because it translates to an awareness of injustice, like a realization of, oh my God, what we are doing to animals is actually very wrong. And this then should lead to feelings of guilt And now the good thing about guilt is that it often leads to reparative efforts. So here we are talking about favorable outcomes, which can be intentions and efforts to either reduce or, of course, ideally eliminate animal product consumption, so to go vegan. Now, based on this model, what were my predictions with regard to Abby and Newe? Well, first of all, I thought Newe, she has this very small request. She only asks people to go as vegan as they feel they can. So I thought that should definitely pose the lesser threat in terms of rights, health, and worldviews, and therefore lead to less anger and less adverse responses. But then Abby, she makes it very clear that any consumption of animal products is totally morally reprehensible. So I thought that should at least have the potential to raise more awareness of injustice, which is morality threat, and could therefore lead to more guilt and more favorable outcomes. Now, we will find out what actually happened, but first I want to talk a little bit about my method. So I had 216 participants with varying degrees of animal product consumption. Most of them were from the UK. Now, participants were randomly allocated either to the abolitionist or the new welfarist strategy. And first, they received a video message from either Abby or Newe. Now, don't be surprised, in the experiment, Abby and Newe looked identical like this, and they shared the name Via. So they really only differed in their lines of argument. And then after that, participants entered a chat and interacted freely with a chatbot named Via that was trained on either one of those two strategies. So this was my intervention, and before and after, I measured all the variables I was interested in using surveys. And there is an example. The items were actually pretty straightforward. So, for example, I measured anger with the question, how much do you feel anger towards vegans, on a scale from 0 to 10? So, pretty simple. Now, what did I find? Now, before I dive into the results, I want to give you a little bit of an overview. So here I want to cover 3 questions. First, which strategy performs better or performed better and why? Then second, are there any exceptions? And third, is the theoretical model actually helpful? So first question, which strategy performed better and why? Now, you might remember my predictions. I actually expected Newe to produce less adverse and Abby more favorable outcomes. And here's what I found. So, as predicted, Newe produced significantly less vegophobia, so less negative feelings towards vegans. She also tended to produce less rejection of vegan products, and against my expectations, Newe also tended to produce stronger intentions to reduce animal product consumption. And there was no effect on the remaining outcomes. So far we can say that Newe performed better because she produced less adverse and slightly more favorable outcomes. Now, next question is, what explains these effects? So here is where my theoretical model comes into play. So I tested the threat categories and the emotions as possible explanatory factors. And what I found was that rights threat really played a central role because it explained at least partially all 3 of these effects. So what happened was that Newe was perceived as less threatening in that respect, and that explained why she had these favorable effects on reduction intentions, and it also explained, at least in part, why she produced less anger and therefore less adverse outcomes. Now, Newe was also perceived as less threatening to people's worldviews, and that also helped explaining why she produced less vegophobia. Now, interestingly, there was a significant part of anger that was not explained by any of the threat categories I tested for, indicating that there might be still something missing in the model. But anyway, so far we can say that Newe performed better overall, and the reason for that was because she was perceived as less threatening to people's rights and worldviews, and she also made them less angry. Next question, are there any exceptions to this? Like, for example, does it matter whether we are speaking to a vegetarian or an omnivore? So here I looked at two different dietary groups. First one, reducers. Now, these are people who already reduced their animal product consumption in some way. Now, in my sample, most of these were vegetarians. And I compared those with what I called unrestricted eaters, so people with absolutely no restrictions on their animal product consumption. First of all, I looked at the differences of those two dietary groups before the intervention. And what I found here was that reducers reported significantly more favorable attitudes towards vegans, veganism, vegan products. They also reported more favorable change intentions and efforts. That might be pretty much as expected. But now the more interesting question is, will they also respond more favorably to vegan messages, especially when they are a little bit more radical? Actually, let me ask you, who believes that reducers, in comparison to unrestricted eaters, will respond more favorably to Abby's abolitionist communication style? Can we do a hands up who believes that? Okay, me as well, actually. I believe that as well. Turns out I was wrong. Reducers actually responded especially adversely, with significantly more anger and significantly more vegophobia than unrestricted eaters. Then again, I thought, well, who cares? I mean, I don't really give a damn if anybody gets angry with me or doesn't like me, as long as people go vegan, or at least get a little bit closer to that goal. So I looked at how anger affected favorable dietary change intentions and efforts. And this is what I found here. So for reducers, and these are the bright green lines here, as anger increased, these favorable dietary change intentions and efforts significantly decreased. So it seems that it might be a good idea to try and avoid triggering anger. Question is how? So I looked at where the anger is coming from. I looked again at the model, this time specifically for reducers. And again, I found that rights threat was at least partially the culprit. So also reducers didn't like the fact that there is somebody trying to tell them what and what not to eat. And again, there was a significant part of anger that was not explained by rights threat or any of the other threat categories I tested for. So again, indicating that this is not the full picture as yet. But what we can say is that based on these findings, we should maybe be especially careful when speaking to reducers and try and avoid making them angry. Now, the next question is Abby actually ever the better option? In short, yes, she is. There were instances when Abby significantly outperformed Newe, and this is what you can see here. Now, in these cases, Abby produced significantly more awareness of injustice, which is morality threat. And she also tended to produce stronger intentions to not only reduce, but to actually eliminate animal product consumption, so to go vegan. Now, this is great, but that only worked as long as worldview threat was low. Meaning that in these cases, participants perceived the message as aligned with their worldviews, with their values and beliefs, you can say. Now, when worldview threat was high, it didn't work, then Abby was actually quite counterproductive. And this is what you can see here. Now, these are post minus pre-difference scores, meaning that anything below 0 indicates a reduction in comparison to the pre-test. So what you can see here is that people actually reduced their awareness of injustice towards animals, which is morality threat, and they reduced their favorable change intentions and efforts they already had before the intervention. So that's not so good. So takeaway here is that, yes, EBI can have superior transformational power, but we have to be a little bit careful with whom we are using this strategy, because she can also be counterproductive. But I also think that here we have a huge opportunity, and here's why. When Newe, she mainly prevents people from going down the other side of the pyramid, and she gets them a little bit on this side. Now, EBI, she can get people much closer towards veganism as long as worldview threat is low. When this isn't the case, she pushes them the other way. So what if we can eliminate this and do only that? And I believe this is possible by using a combination of those two strategies, or what I call a flexible hybrid approach. Meaning that we use EBI as much as we can, but when we are met with resistance, or when we just can't align the message with people's values and beliefs, we switch to a less radical communication strategy. That way, we should be able to get people as much as possible towards veganism, but we can also maybe make sure that they stay on the right side of the pyramid, and we can prevent these counterproductive effects from canceling the good ones out. So I believe that this might be a good strategy to be more effective overall. And I'm actually really curious to find out what you think about this, but now we don't have time for Q&A, but maybe you can approach me and what you think of that, and we can chat about it. For now, I have one last question, and that is the theoretical model actually helpful? Because so far we know that rights threat and worldview threat, they were relevant with regard to some of the outcomes, but what about the remaining threat categories? And what I did here is I looked at the associations between the threat categories and the outcomes before the intervention. And I'm actually going to set the emotions aside to keep things a little bit more digestible. And what I found here was that rights threat and worldview threat were associated with more adverse outcomes, specifically vegophobia and rejection of vegan products. Now, health threat was also associated with more adverse outcomes, including speciesism, and it was associated with less favorable ones, and that was significant for all the favorable outcomes except elimination effort. Now, morality threat, here it was the exact opposite pattern. Morality threat was associated with more favorable and less adverse outcomes, and this was significant for all the outcomes I was interested in. So, takeaway here is that all four threat categories seem to be relevant, at least with regard to some of the outcomes, and morality threat appeared to be the most beneficial and the most important one, being really consistently associated with more favorable and less adverse outcomes. So here is my general or overall conclusion. How can we get closer to a vegan world, or how can we get people to the right side of the pyramid? Now, based on my findings, I believe that we might get at least closer to that goal by using advocacy that keeps threats to rights, health, and worldviews as low as possible, and at the same time increases morality threat. Now, question is, how can we do this in practical terms? So here I have some ideas. So first of all, how can we increase morality threat? This is possible by using the abolitionist strategy, but it only works as long as we can keep worldview threat low. The way to do this is to align the message with people's worldviews, with people's values and beliefs. Now, when this doesn't work, based on my findings, I would highly recommend to switch to Newe's communication strategy. Then, rights threat, people really don't like to be told what to do. They hate the feeling of being patronized. One way to avoid this is to use the new welfarist strategy. But I also know that the abolitionists among you will not be so happy with the solution. So I have another suggestion that, however, at this point is more of a working theory, and that is to combine the abolitionist strategy with autonomy supportive language. So what I mean by this is to emphasize people's free will and choice. So for example, you might say something like, I believe we have a moral obligation to be vegan, but you have the choice. You can decide whether you want to continue supporting the suffering, the atrocities, the exploitation, or whether you want to do something else with it. Then health threat, here we might be able to counteract by providing trustworthy, relevant information that can mitigate these concerns. And I also believe that we might be able to increase morality threat by exposing people to morally shocking footage of animal suffering and industry practices. Now, as noted, here's more research needed. Also, neither the model nor this list is exhaustive, which leads me to some more limitations I want to mention. You might have noticed that some of my conclusions are based on exploratory and correlational analysis. Now, in science, this means that we have to be a little bit careful here with the interpretation, and there is also more research needed. Now, regarding the chatbots, I had some trouble. They didn't always fully adhere to the prompts, but overall, I think they did quite a good job. And I also believe that AI chatbots can be a really promising tool in vegan advocacy because they are infinitely scalable. They can really have thousands, if not millions, of tailored one-to-one conversations at the same time, which I believe can be highly effective. So what's next for me? Well, I want to really strategically develop and test the effectiveness of this flexible hybrid approach. Also, I'm planning to look into other promising strategies. There is one I'm quite interested in. It's the coaching-inspired approach from We the Free. Why I find it interesting? Because it's inherently autonomy supportive. And I believe this might be a great way to mitigate rights-related threats. Then, yeah, if you're listening to this and saying, I have just a great strategy, please tell me about it. I would be really interested. And also, I'm exploring ways to maximize the impact of these one-to-one conversations using AI chatbots. So if you're working in this sector and are interested in a collaboration, I would also love to connect. And yeah, I am aware that this was probably quite a lot of input, a lot of findings. So here is what I believe to be my 3 main takeaways. So first of all, yes, EBI can have superior transformational power, but that only works as long as we can keep worldview threat low. Now, when we can't do this, based on my findings, I believe Newe is the safer choice, and I would also recommend to use a little bit of a flexible strategy. And in general, it's probably a good idea to keep threats to rights, health, and worldviews as low as possible, and at the same time, increase morality threat. Now, in case you'd like to dig deeper, you can access my complete thesis and all the references via this QR code, and I will keep it for you in the bottom left corner here. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation, so I want to thank you for your interest, your attention. I also, huge thanks to IARC for hosting me and for organizing this. Thanks also to all the volunteers, and a special shout out to my thesis advisors and family back home for all their support. Now, here you have all my contact details, and yeah, and with this, I look forward to, when we have time, to 1 or 2 questions. So thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Antonia. So I think we could do like 1 quick question.
That one thing struck me. You said that Abby's strategy fails miserably with reducers, didn't you? And at the same time, you say if the worldview isn't challenged, but it's aligned, then her strategy works. Doesn't that mean logically that reducers don't have the worldview of veganism or of wanting to reduce it for ethical reasons?
There might be actually both going on. I mean, these were separate analyses. Now, I wouldn't say every strategy failed, because for reducers, Newe's strategy, I think, worked a little bit better, or at least didn't trigger as much anger or vegophobia. These were the two outcomes where I saw the difference at. But it's actually a very interesting question. It's maybe something I could look into in the future, how these things really look together, because now it's a separate analysis, basically, looking at how reducers respond to either one of those two strategies, and then also how the overall sample responded to either one of those two strategies, depending on the level of worldview threat. So this is interesting, but I'm probably not able to answer that question at this moment.
Okay, so we do have one question from the online audience. So one person wants to know, was there any follow-up with the participants to look at effects over time?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Was there any follow-up with the participants to look at effects over time?
Okay, there was actually one variable that I obtained 2 to 3 weeks after the intervention, and this was effort. So how much people actually tried to either reduce or eliminate animal product consumption. So that gives a little bit of a glimpse of longer-term effects, but that was the only variable I used in this example for this matter. So this would be also something really interesting to look at in the future, how this really develops in a longer time frame.
All right, is there another question from the audience here? Okay, one quick question, and then we'll finish up afterwards.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. One question about the about Abby's strategy. So from Melanie Joy, I also learned that you may cause some feelings of shame when you really trigger morality problems with the non-vegans. While you say this triggering of guilt can even lead to positive effects. So that's a bit something where I see some, it's a new aspect for sure, but do you have some thoughts on this, how this shaming fits into your results?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, actually. There's actually a difference in psychology. It's two different mechanisms or two different emotions, really, guilt and shame. So shame really is usually something when a person has the feeling like I am bad, whereas guilt more translates to I did something bad, and therefore guilt is more often observed to lead to reparative efforts, whereas shame is more likely to lead to defensive reactions, to safeguard the self, basically.
I want to say thank you so much for your presentation, Antonia.
Thank you so much as well. Thanks.